Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexis Alvarez. I'm the Director of Statewide Training, and I'm very excited to be here with you in community to learn about trauma-informed lawyering. For those of you who registered today, you probably already know this, but just to reiterate, this is part one of a two-part series. In part one of this series, we are going to talk about what, why, how, sort of the basic understanding of what trauma-informed lawyering is, and in part two, we're going to focus on practical tips in implementing the title, which is more than just a spa day, how to get your trauma-informed lawyering into a safe space that you can actually utilize it and handle it and get on top of it and master it. As always, there's housekeeping announcements. I'm sorry for the boring stuff, but I'll try to make it quick. This is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be sent to all of you who registered. Even if you only registered for part two, you'll still get part one. If you have to hop off early because we know you're very busy, you'll still get a copy of the full recording. So don't worry, and thank you for being here. Two, this was approved for CLE credit. Each part actually has its own independent CLE code. At the end of this session, I will announce out loud the CLE code for part one, and then I'll also put it into the chat, and you will also receive that code along with the recording that will be sent to you. Same thing for part two. I'll have at the end of that session, I'll announce the CLE code, I'll put it into the chat, and you'll get it with a copy of the recording. As always, you can reach out to me directly. I'm going to put my email address into the chat. If you don't see that CLE code or you missed the copy of the recording or anything like that, you can always reach out to me for anything. Other piece of housekeeping announcements, and I did this last time, so I did not turn on the closed captions, and I'm going to do that now. So anyone who does need to enable the closed captions, please feel free. Questions and answers. We love to hear your questions, and we always want to answer them. It's always important to be engaged with the audience, especially in a topic like this. So don't be shy. Please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A. We prefer them in the Q&A section for us to address as we go on. So what I mean by as we go on is if you're listening to the content, we're on a particular slide, you have a question that's relevant to that subject matter, pop it into the chat, and I will do my best to bring it up to our speaker to answer in live time. Other things such as polls or other things that we might do or questions, you can put that into the chat, but our speaker will elaborate on that more fully once we get there. And I think that's it for the housekeeping announcements. There's always something that I forget, but it's being recorded, CLE credit, questions and answers, locked and loaded, ready to go. And so now I'm going to move on to introductions of our speaker here today. For those of you who joined us last week, we had our speaker, Emily Calvin, who's with us again here today. And at that point, she spoke for us about domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And today she's talking to us about trauma-informed lawyering. So Emily is in these fields and in the work that she does, really, really knowledgeable about these subjects. So before I read her bio, I just want to say, Emily, thank you for being here. And also on the Zoom, folks will notice we have Samantha Howell, who is present. Samantha Howell is with Three Rivers Legal Services, and Samantha is part of this training series. She will actually be giving you part two next week, but she is present. And as always, I want to acknowledge everyone who is present and here with us today. So to introduce Emily and then turn it over to her. After graduating from the University of Florida, Levin School of Law, Emily began her legal career at Three Rivers Legal Services. During her 5 years at Three Rivers Legal Services, Emily represented survivors of domestic, sexual, and repeat violence in injunction for protection cases, dissolutions of marriage, paternity cases, and other related family law cases. Emily also served as the managing attorney of the Lake City office of Three River Legal Services, supervising multiple staff attorneys, paralegals, and other support staff, in addition to managing her own caseload. Emily has an extensive experience in family law litigation with a strong passion for assisting survivors of crime and or intimate partner violence. And as of now, I have the extreme pleasure of working with Emily at Florida Legal Services, where I get to be her colleague, supporting her in all of the great work that she does. And so with that being said, I'm 2 minutes over my introduction time. I'm going to turn it over to Emily.
Thank you so much, Alexis. It's so great to be here. And I'm really happy to be having this conversation, getting started, and then Samantha will do kind of continue on with this next week. But I have been sort of thinking about doing a training like this for a long time. And I think that it's really important to think about what is trauma, what does it mean to be trauma informed, and why is that important as attorneys and in our legal practice? And then how do we do that? What does that look like? So that's kind of what I want to go over today. But the first thing I wanted to talk about, I'll start, Alexis read my bio, but I want to talk a little bit about my background before I went to law school and before I started with Three Rivers, just to kind of show that show my history of working with survivors of violence and kind of around these issues, and why I'm doing this today, and what my experience is like working with people who have been through trauma. And so I'm not going to, belabor this, but basically the first, I would say, I started my advocacy work in college at Boston University. A group of us founded the Women's Center that it had been around and then kind of dissolved, and we restarted it. And that was sort of a rape crisis center at the time. It has since evolved into other things. But then in law school, I volunteered at a sexual assault crisis hotline when I was in North Carolina. Then I ended up graduating from UF, like Alexis said. And after that, well, during law school at UF, I volunteered in the domestic violence with the domestic violence attorney, doing research, interviewing clients, that kind of work. I was also a certified legal intern at the Intimate Partner Violence Assistance Clinic at UF. And I represented, under the supervision of an attorney, I represented a few clients in court for injunctions for protection. Right out of law school, while I was studying for the bar exam, I worked at the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence, where I trained domestic violence advocates as well as child welfare professionals for the most part, some law enforcement and other community partners, on the intersection between domestic violence and child welfare issues. And then after I passed the bar, I started working at Three Rivers. Alexis already talked about that. And then most recently, I have started working at Florida Legal Services. And at Three Rivers, I did family injunctions, divorces, paternity, things like that. And I'm still focusing mostly on those types of areas, but I'm working on the domestic violence hotline, statewide domestic violence hotline. So we kind of serve survivors of domestic violence, but on any kind of civil issue, housing, other related issues that they have. I'm starting to learn some more areas of law too. So all of my experience, though, the point is, has been focused around serving survivors of domestic and sexual violence. This is my passion. This is what I care about. And I do think that my history in the field of advocacy prior to entering the legal field has really informed my work as an attorney and my work with clients in a way that I want to share with you all today. So now I want to talk about kind of what we're going to do today and what my plans are for what I'd like to cover. So first, I want to talk about what it means to be trauma informed, and then we'll talk about why it matters to be trauma informed. And then we'll back up a little bit and look at trauma in general. What is it? How prevalent is it? What are some statistics about it? And what does it look like in reality? Things like the physical manifestations of trauma, how you can recognize someone having a trauma reaction in our work. And then what can we do? What are some strategies and tips for working with trauma survivors, and how can we best support them in a way that allows us to zealously advocate for them in the best way possible? And so that's kind of the goal today, is really to understand, what does it mean to be trauma informed? Why is it important? How, because I think I would venture to guess, I think I can confidently say at least 99% of the clients we serve as attorneys have been through some kind of trauma, because they are in a legal, a legal case. We are attorneys, so no matter what, litigation can be traumatic, if nothing else, but probably what led them to us might have been traumatic as well. And so I think it's being trauma informed in our lawyering is important to be able to serve our clients and get the work done as best we can. So I'm going to dive right in. We'll talk about what it means to provide a trauma-informed approach and what that really looks like. So I'll go ahead and just move on to the next one. Okay. So, we'll dig into trauma-informed lawyering, but first I want to start with just trauma-informed is a concept that is used in a lot of different areas. Trauma-informed services more generally is something that people talk about, trying to make sure that we are centering someone's trauma in figuring out how we're going to serve them, how we're going to engage with them, and how we're going to best support them. So keeping in mind what they are going through and what they have gone through in figuring out how to work with them and how to strategize with them and how to support them and communicate with them, and kind of be their best advocate as we possibly can be. So I think one of the most important things in defining what it means to be trauma-informed and to approach things from a trauma-informed perspective is that the goal here is to minimize re-traumatization as much as possible. So keeping in mind what they've been through, the trauma they've experienced, and what that does to them after the fact and the continuing effects of trauma, how do we serve them without making it worse, without re-traumatizing them? Because they are going to have to tell us their story, their trauma. They've probably told a bunch of people before they got to us. They're going to have to tell it to the judge. And it's exhausting and they can shut down. And so I think it's really important to minimize that re-traumatization so that we can get what we need from them and get them to tell the judge or whomever, the information that they need to hear. So because we haven't kind of re-traumatized them in that process, they can share that information in a way that's effective and communicates what they need and what they've been going through. So why does it matter to be trauma informed? I think that it's important, of course, because we care about people and it's important to be nice and kind and supportive, but there's so much more than that. And that's really what I want to get into today, is that there is a lot of reasons that it is important and helpful to be trauma informed, aside from the fact that it makes our client feel good. Of course, that's part of it. But the other big part of it is that it makes it easier to do our job, and it creates this relationship with the client that makes it easier to advocate for them and to present their story in court, to negotiate with them, for them to listen to us and do what we're asking them to do and to benefit their case. It just helps create this relationship with your client that creates trust and creates a rapport that you can work together throughout the life of the case. It helps the client open up. If you are trauma informed and you approach them from a trauma informed perspective, they are going to be more willing to tell you everything that's happened to them and everything they've been going through and all of the details that they can remember, which we'll talk about the memory a little bit later. But giving the client that sense of control and neutralizing the power imbalance really assists in making sure that the client is working with us and giving us the information that we need in order to best serve them. And I think it's important to recognize that power imbalance. When we work with our clients, there is inherently a power imbalance between an attorney and a client. We know the law as more than they do. We know how to navigate the system better than they do. We have this sense of we have this authority that they don't have. They're not experts in the law. They haven't probably gone through this before, or at least not as many times as we have as attorneys. And so they feel, I think a lot of times there is this power dynamic that can shut people off and can close them down. I know a lot of times, for example, when I talk to people on the hotline, they're very, they kind of associate with us with the rest of the system that they've been encountering so far. So, law enforcement won't listen to me. The judge doesn't care. And I know you're not going to listen either because you're working with all of them. And it's important to show that, just because we are experts in the law and we're attorneys and we have this license doesn't mean that we're part of, this system that has been exercising power over them this whole time. So in order to neutralize the power that we have over that relationship, we have to acknowledge that we have that power, and we have to recognize it, and we have to make an effort to connect with the client and to kind of give them some of the power over the relationship. And that doesn't mean that we're going to allow them to dictate our practice or our strategy or anything about, what we have to do as attorneys. But what it does mean is that any chance that we have to give the client an opportunity for input and to really make sure that the client understands that this is a partnership, the better it'll be throughout the life of the case to work with them. And the more successful things will be throughout the life of the case. I'm not saying you'll win your case, but the relationship with your client will be better. And no matter what happens with the case, they might be less likely to blame you for it if things don't go well, because we know it's not our fault. But some other reasons it matters, again, I talked about minimizing re-traumatization, and empowering the client to be able to continue with their lives after the litigation is over, easing their anxieties. And what that easing their anxieties does, in my experience, is save us valuable time. Because if our clients feel empowered, feel in control, they have their homework to go do, they have their part of this case that they're working on, they're going to call us in a panic a lot less frequently. And that's going to save us time to work on the case in our time, the way that we need to. And we're not spending all this time on the phone, kind of talking them off of the ledge, figuratively or literally, even though that's not our job, right? So we need to make sure that the client has this enough of a sense of control over what is happening to them in their case and how we're handling their case, so that they do not, call us 5 times a day and we don't spend a bunch of time talking to them when we need to spend that time working on their case. I know you all, I'm sure, know what I'm talking about with clients that are very anxious and they call a lot. And I've had to tell some clients, the more you call me, the less I have time to work on your case. And that being able to kind of front load the work of giving them respect and neutralizing that power imbalance and giving them some sense of control really saves time on the back end. So it's a win-win, save time for us, help the client in a way that they feel empowered and, feel good about what's going on, or at least better than they would be if we were just kind of ignoring their trauma and treating them like their, experience didn't matter. So now I want to talk about, back up a little bit and talk about trauma, because in order to be effective at providing trauma-informed services, we have to understand what trauma is and how prevalent it is. So you all are attorneys and legal professionals. I think we generally understand the definition of trauma, but it's basically, it's an overwhelming experience. And I think what I would like to point out in defining trauma is that everyone defines trauma differently, and something that is traumatic for one person might not be traumatic for another. And so we can define trauma as something that overwhelms the sense of safety, the ability to cope, makes you feel hopeless, all these kinds of emotions. But certain experiences are going to be traumatic for some and not for others. And it's not our job or our place to define what has been traumatic for this person. And if it doesn't seem like that would be traumatic for us, it doesn't mean it's not for them. So we want to make sure that we allow our clients to define their own trauma, and to, when they tell us this was a traumatic event, that we need to believe that and we need to take that seriously. And it's not our place to say, well, that wouldn't have traumatized me, or the other way around. I think some people, especially working in domestic violence, a lot of times it's like, I hear things and it's like, wow, that would be incredibly traumatic, but it is not the worst thing that they've gone through. And so, they don't define that as really the traumatic event that they carry with them. And so I think we can't make assumptions about what someone's trauma, how someone defines an experience and whether that is traumatic or not, but we just need to understand what trauma looks like. And so that we know how to support people when they're going through it, or when they have gone through it and are experiencing kind of a triggered reaction to what's going on. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, I just wanted to touch on that very briefly, is something that continues on after the trauma is over. It is an experience where there's a really negative perception of not only what has happened, but how the sense of safety in the future, things like hypervigilance, things like, not trusting people, something that you carry on way after that traumatic event has ended. And one important thing to note here is that not every traumatic event is going to cause PTSD. And so we can't always assume that all our clients have PTSD. I think a lot of them probably do, but just because someone has been through something traumatic does not mean that they are experiencing PTSD. They might not, but it is something that can develop as a result of a traumatic incident or multiple traumatic incidents. So now I want to talk a little bit about how prevalent trauma is. So if people are able to, I'm going to ask some questions. And so I want you to kind of put your thoughts in the chat. So first I wanted to kind of go back up before we get into these statistics. I wanted to let people know that these statistics are going to address rape, sexual assault, physical abuse, intimate partner violence, childhood trauma, and homelessness. And so, take care of yourself. Samantha next week will be talking a lot more about how you can do that. But if you need to step away, take a bathroom break, whatever, just make sure that you are taking care of yourself in this process. So my first question that I want people to put their thoughts in the chat are, what percentage of people do you think have experienced sexual violence? So I'm going to give it a couple little bit of time to see if people can put their thoughts in the chat. 30%, 95, 50. Yeah. Okay. So we're getting a good range of thoughts. 1 in 4, 20. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We got a couple 60, 75. Yep. Okay. So I think a lot of people, there's a lot of at least like over half, or yeah, we're kind of getting a wide range of numbers. So this is good. This is good because I think, and reported, that's a good point. Somebody put in a parenthetical about reported. So that is one thing that I need to comment on for all of these statistics is they are reported. And especially with domestic and sexual violence and things like that, we know they're very severely underreported. So we can assume these numbers are probably higher in reality. So 43.6% of women and 24.8% of men have experienced some kind of sexual violence in their life. And I know there are more genders than women and men. This is the statistic that I could find on this, but I have some other statistics in a little bit about other genders as well. But you can see that it's almost half of women and a quarter of men. And these are reported numbers again. So I think that it's probably safe to say it's a lot higher than this, but we don't actually know that. So that's the number there. And so the next question is, what is the rate of violent victimization amongst transgender persons? And this is in relation to cisgender people. So like kind of what is the rate of victimization among trans people versus cis people? That's kind of what I'm getting at here. So go ahead and put your thoughts in the chat. What do you think about kind of how the rate of trans? Okay, we got 80%. I don't know if these are responding to, here we go, 80%, 70. Yeah, okay. Okay. All right, and you got 70. All right, so we're talking pretty high. Yeah, so I think, people think 40. Okay. I think it's safe to assume probably that it's higher, right? I think that the more marginalized genders experience probably more violence. So let's look at the numbers here. The rate of violent victimization against trans people is 2.5 times the rate among cis people. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind when we are working with clients that are maybe trans and or non-binary, gender non-conforming, et cetera, that it is more dangerous for them and the rate of victimization is even higher than cis people. Okay. How prevalent do we think trauma is among the unhoused, the homeless population? What do people think? You don't have to put a number, or you can, any thoughts? What do we think about how many people who are unhoused or experiencing homelessness have gone through trauma? 100%. Yeah, these are really high. Well, I mean, I think the homelessness is traumatic in and of itself. And so I think that 100% is a really probably a correct answer. The statistic that I pulled here I thought was really interesting. Over 90% of sheltered, so unhoused, but in a shelter, and low-income mothers have experienced physical and sexual assault. So that's in addition to the trauma of being unhoused. And this number is specifically about low-income mothers. It talked about mothers having the highest prevalence of some sort of trauma in addition to being unhoused. And so, over 90%, that's reported. That's a huge number. And I think, these 100% numbers are, possibly on the dot there. Okay. And then how early do we think intimate partner violence starts? So, how old do you think people are when they are victimized, and kind of what percentage of you don't have to put numbers, but just anything. Yeah. Teenage parents. It is a learned behavior. That's right. Learned from parents. That's important. Birth. Yeah. So intimate partner violence starts pretty young, and definitely like birth, if the child is born into a household where, one parent is perpetuating intimate partner violence over the family. Absolutely. Any other thoughts before I go to the numbers on this? How early intimate partner violence starts? So 10% of U.S. This is the United States. All these numbers are the U.S., by the way. 10% of U.S. high school students reported experiencing physical dating violence. 11% sexual dating violence, all within the last 12 months at the time of the survey. So, high school, teenage years. I think that it possibly starts even younger than that, depending on what they're growing up in, and the environment, and all of these, so many different factors. I know we talk about the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, and that's growing up in a home where a parent is perpetrating intimate partner violence, and learning that, and perpetuating that as well. And so it's sort of this ongoing cycle that I think it's important to really try to address young, and to acknowledge that a lot of children and teenagers, young children, are experiencing this. How common do we think PTSD is in adults? This number really surprised me. I don't know, we can talk about kind of what my thoughts are after we look at it, and anyone else's thoughts, but what percentage do we think of adults have experienced, or have had, or do have PTSD? 50%, 75, 85. Okay, so these are higher numbers. Yep. Okay, I promise this number was found in a study, and I double checked all of this, and it seems incredibly low, but the number was about 5% have PTSD in any given year. Now, the one other time I did this presentation, we talked kind of a little bit about why we think that number is so low. It kind of goes back to like that reported versus non-reported. I think it's really about the difficulty of receiving a diagnosis of PTSD. As you see, this study, it is focused on all adults, but it's from the Department of Veterans Affairs. I think that that's something where it's hard to access mental health treatment to even get access to a diagnosis of PTSD. So how many adults do we think have experienced PTSD? I'm sure it's way higher, but how many have this diagnosis and have, received enough treatment to get the diagnosis and have it be reported? It's very low. So I think it's important there to acknowledge there's a big disparity in what people are experiencing and what they're getting treated for, and what they have access to treatment for. And then I think this is the last one. Right. Yeah. Many people believe that state of mind is common, and not that it's a mental health issue. That's a good point too. It's kind of something people just live with and accept, and they don't treat it as a diagnosis, a mental health diagnosis. Yeah. Okay. So how prevalent is trauma among children? Sort of going back to those ACEs experiences. I know we talked about intimate partner violence. This is backing up a little bit more. How prevalent do we think trauma is among young children, among, young adults and children. Any thoughts? I don't see anything, but I'll just go to this. Okay, 80%. We got over 2/3 of children reported at least one traumatic event by the age of 16. Very prevalent, vastly underreported. That's right. So that's a lot, at least one. So that means that there's so many children growing up with these, whether it's diagnosed or not, or what, complex PTSD, like these ongoing traumatic events that they're experiencing, growing up in a home with, intimate partner violence or substance abuse or being around violence in the community, anything like that. These are all traumatic events, if that's how they define it. And 16, it's still pretty young. And I think probably if we really drilled into the numbers, those traumatic events happen way earlier than 16 a lot of the time. So it's just, the point of this is that it is very prevalent, and it is very likely that the client that you are working with has experienced some kind of trauma, in addition to going through litigation, which again, I have said can be very traumatic in and of itself. There's a large chance that they have experienced some form of trauma by the time they get to you. So I want to talk now about what it looks like when a survivor of trauma is experiencing some kind of reaction or is being triggered. I know kind of the word triggered has been thrown around a lot. What I'm talking about when I use that is when someone is having a reaction to what is happening that is kind of bringing them back to the traumatic incident. So they're not in the traumatic incident, but they're reacting to it as if they are. And we'll talk about what some of the common manifestations are and what they look like. And so one thing I do want to say is that everyone reacts differently to trauma. So just like one thing can be traumatic to one person and not to another, one person's reactions to their trauma, their triggers, their manifestations can look completely different than someone else. So these are some common ones to look out for. But, just because someone isn't showing maybe these manifestations, but you're kind of getting the sense like they've been through some trauma, they're having some issues. It's not one of these common ones, but I can tell there's something going on here. I think it's still important to recognize that could be a trauma response, even if it doesn't look like what the common, responses are that I'm going over. But there are a lot, and people can be triggered by different things and can have different reactions to those triggers. And triggers can be something that you don't even know, or they're not even aware of being a trigger. Certain things kind of can bring you back there that weren't even expected. But then also some kind of expected triggers are when they're retelling what happened to them. I think we can generally expect some triggering experiences there. Maybe not, but I think it's important to look out for that. So we'll dig into some of these a little bit more, but I just kind of wanted to show you some of the topics that we're going to talk about, what they really look like. But we've got flooding, minimization. We're going to define all of these and kind of drill into them a little bit. But these are just some of the manifestations of trauma. There are so many. You can, read about it, look into it more. But these are the ones that I thought were really important and that I saw a lot, that I thought were pretty common to take a look at. Okay, so flooding. Flooding is the first one that I think is really common, that I see a lot in working with clients. So flooding, kind of intuitive, goes with what it sounds like. It's when someone is flooded with all these memories at once. And what that looks like is that they are not telling a linear story. They're all over the place. They're just throwing details at you, throwing facts at you. This happened. Oh, and then 3 days before this, and then a year ago this, and then I forgot to mention he was wearing this, and he also did that, or she was running this way, or whatever. It's just like they're dumping all these facts and details on you, and it is not linear. It is not orderly. It's hard to make sense of. They are probably experiencing some flooding in that moment. And we'll talk a little bit later about what we can do in things like that, in moments like that. But I think it's important to recognize that when someone is flooding and their memories are all over the place and they're kind of, inundating you with details that don't make sense in any kind of order, they're not doing it intentionally. It is a reaction to what they are experiencing, and they are not trying to confuse you. They are not trying to make your job difficult. They are trying to give you the information, and their brain is literally not able to stretch it out into a linear, story. It's the part of the brain. I'm not, a scientist, but I do know that the part of the brain that stores memories and retells them, it shuts down when you're experiencing trauma. And so the memories are stored differently, if at all. There's a lot of black spots, a lot of like, I'm seeing all these things and I don't know what order they happened in. That is normal for trauma, and it doesn't mean that they're making up their story. It just means that they are remembering all of it at once and not necessarily in the order it happened in. So, right. Okay. So I kind of touched on this already, that the traumatic memories are stored in the limbic system, which is not the part of the brain responsible for thinking. And so it really is, they're not doing this intentionally. They are just, all their memories of this event are like dumped into this spot that doesn't function in a way that allows them to tell us a really, simple story to follow. And it is also more likely to occur when there's repeated ongoing trauma, complex trauma, when it just happens more than, one incident, it can be traumatic. And then when we talk about ongoing trauma, that can be, for example, intimate partner violence, but there are a lot of other examples of that that I can't think of in the moment. But basically when this traumatic, it's less an incident and more an ongoing experience. And so really, then the brain is not storing these memories for however long this trauma is going on, days, weeks, years, so it's really going to be like a bunch of info dumping that you have to sort through to figure out what's going on and what happened. Especially if they've been going through it for, a year or years or, however long. I think that it's important to acknowledge that flooding is more likely to happen the longer it has been going on. And so we really need to try to kind of take good notes and figure out how to put it in an order that we can, support them and represent them with. Minimization. So minimization, as it says, is minimizing the importance or the intensity of a traumatic experience or justifying the harm. I see this a lot in intimate partner violence work. And I do think a lot of it, or at least part of it, has to do with the fact that minimization is a tactic that abusers use to make their violence and their behavior and their abuse seem less abusive, or, kind of confuse the survivor into thinking, oh, it wasn't that bad. It was really your fault. If you hadn't done XYZ, I wouldn't have, done this to you. And so you start to sort of internalize that narrative and minimize it as well. But there's also other reasons beyond the fact that someone else might be minimizing their experience or what's being done to them. There's other kind of reasons that survivors of trauma can minimize their experience when they're retelling it to us. And so one of those is it's a coping mechanism. So it's the brain's way of separating, here's what I feel about what happened and here's what happened. And if I focus so much on how I felt in that moment, it's going to feel so big that I can't possibly cope with that. And so it's a sort of compartmentalization of like, this is what happened, and the way I feel about it is not gonna come out. The really upsetting pieces of it are stored away, and I'm just gonna tell you what happened. And I think that's important for a couple of reasons. One, if we don't acknowledge or recognize that they are minimizing their trauma in this moment, then we might be inclined to minimize what happened to them. And I'm not saying we should exaggerate what has happened to them, but we need to understand legally what the impacts are of what happened to them and the impacts on their case, and how we can best educate the court and convey their story to the judge in a way that doesn't downplay what this other person has done to them, even though the survivor might be minimizing it. So we need to make sure that we're not minimizing their trauma, even though they might be. And also, I think we need to keep in mind, like, I think sometimes there's an expectation like, oh, they're telling me this. If they're not sobbing as they're telling me this story, they must not be very upset about it. And it's probably not a traumatic event by their definition or whatever. Just because someone is not displaying distress while they're telling you what happened does not mean it wasn't a distressing incident that caused trauma. It could mean that they're compartmentalizing their emotions from what happened, and they're just, minimizing it as a way to cope with it and to move on with their life and to tell you what has happened without, sobbing as they're talking and falling apart every time they tell this story to someone. Dissociation, again, kind of goes into that compartmentalization, really separating themselves from the trauma. So there's minimizing it. Oh, it wasn't as bad as it sounds, so that I can move on with my life and exist and not feel like this horrible tragic event is defining me. And then dissociation, where it's okay, well, it happened, but I'm fine. I don't have, I'm not experiencing these emotions, and kind of stepping out of my body when I'm talking about what happened to me. So this is important. This compartmentalization piece is important when we're trying to get details from our client, and it may take a few conversations, a few interviews to get some really important details. I know, for example, in my practice, I'll talk to a survivor of intimate partner violence several times, and then maybe the third or fourth time I talk to them, we're going over an incident and they say, oh, I forgot to mention he strangled me. And it's like, you forgot to mention that. That's a really important detail. You would think if it really happened, you wouldn't forget to mention that. But that is a dangerous way of thinking. And it is not a trauma-informed way of thinking. I think that it's important to understand that, yes, they might have forgotten that happened because they locked it away. They compartmentalized that piece because it was so traumatic and it was too much to really process and think about. So they just locked it away, and it's slowly coming back as they're talking to you. As you're providing trauma-informed services to them, they're starting to remember, oh yeah, this happened. So just because someone didn't tell you something right away doesn't mean it's not true, and it doesn't mean it's not important. In fact, I would say that sometimes the details that seem pretty big that come out later are probably some of the more important pieces of what they've been through. And we need to find a way to be gentle about using, capitalizing on that in court. You need to testify to the judge. The judge needs to know that this happened, because it's a really strong piece of your case, but also acknowledging that this is a really hard thing to talk about, and how can we do this in a way that, again, minimizes that re-traumatization. I see Alexis, and I do see you.
Yeah, thank you. And so a question did come in. It came in through the chat, so I wanted to catch it. Someone did ask, how prevalent is dissociative order? I'm not sure if that's something, if you know the stat or whatever, but that was the question.
I mean, that's a great question. I don't know the answer. I will say that, dissociation doesn't necessarily mean that someone is going to develop dissociative disorder. When I'm talking about dissociation, I'm really talking about that, like, response or reaction in the moment of retelling. But certainly just the way that PTSD can develop from trauma, but doesn't always, certainly these things, these experiences and what we've been through can become disorders, can become bigger or, longer lasting than like, oh, this moment I'm experiencing dissociation. But as far as, numbers and prevalence, I don't have an answer to that. But I would expect that it certainly happens, that people, especially, when it's ongoing trauma, that it becomes like a part of how they function, because it is happening so much that it just sort of becomes this pathology, I guess. But I don't know the numbers on that. But that's a great question. I think it's interesting, and I'd be curious to find out.
Thank you, Emily.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so physical reactions, these are things that, you can see with your client as they're telling you this story, as they're retelling what's happening, things to look out for in the way they're actually behaving and the way that they're telling you. I mean, whether you see them in person or on the phone, I kind of want to touch on a few different things to look out for when they're talking on the phone versus when you're in person with them. What these physical reactions might indicate as far as whether they're being triggered in this moment. So I think it's from what I've read and, in my experience, it's pretty common for someone to have some form of physical reaction to their trauma when they're discussing it or thinking about it or retelling it. So things that I see a lot, actually, I'm going to go back here. So sweating, nightmares, of course. So if they say like, I can't sleep, I'm having nightmares, I'm having anxiety attacks, they're clenching their jaw, their headaches, that can come from the jaw pain. The clenching the jaw can develop into headaches. They're not feeling well. They're kind of like pacing around. They're twitching, I don't know, like twitching the knee or picking or, just kind of like sort of nervous tics. I think that is something that happens very frequently when people are retelling what's happening. It helps them get out some of that energy that they're trying to maybe disassociate from, but it helps them kind of process what they're telling without it really taking over their entire emotional state. And so those are important to recognize so that we can take a minute. Okay, I see that you've been twitching your leg, but now not that you would point this out, but if you notice like someone is, fidgeting and they start doing it more and faster and more aggressively, and it's starting to get to the point that it's almost distracting, I think that is a moment where you can take a little break, help ground them. And we're going to get into some more strategies in a minute, but take a minute and don't just barrel through with your questions about all this traumatic stuff they're talking about. If you're really seeing they're having some major physical reactions, that's a good time to take a minute and, do you want some water? Do you want to take a break? Do you want to step outside and come back in? Or, just kind of give them a moment and try to bring them back to you're here, you're safe. I know we're talking about this really stressful thing, but how can I support you so that I can continue to get the information I need about what happened to you? Again, that's the bottom line here. Of course, we want to support our clients because it's the right thing to do, but also if they're experiencing a physical reaction and they have been very triggered by talking to you, we're not going to get what we need in order to best represent them. And so if they're really freaking out on the moment, we need to give them a minute and give them the space to recover so that we can continue the interview and finish getting all the information, because otherwise they're just going to shut down and you won't get what you needed to get in order to best advocate for them. And, things on the phone, some things that you can kind of tell when someone's like pacing around or, their volume's going in and out, they're walking around. You can hear a lot of background noise. You can tell they're, opening cabinets, doing stuff, they're distracted. You can say, I'm not advocating for letting them off the phone and calling them later, but you can change the subject to something a little less stressful, and then come back to it. That's one thing that I do a lot is like, okay, I know this is getting really stressful. So let's talk about some simple stuff first. What's your birthday? What are your kids' birthdays? It's some basic information that you need. And then let's put a pin in that. We'll come back to that. We're going to back up and talk about some not so emotional things. And we'll come back to that in a minute. And, once you observe that some of those physical reactions are kind of calming down, then you can get back into it. And that's why it's important to check in with your client, pay attention to how they are reacting to the conversation. So that gets me into working with trauma survivors. What are some communication tips, some strategies to build that trust? We've talked about what does it all look like. Now, what do we do about it? How can we, that we know what it looks like. Now what? How do we support them? What is that trauma-informed approach? So one of the things that I think we can really do to help is to manage our clients' expectations. Again, going back to that, giving them a sense of control, empowering them. And that doesn't mean letting them control how you handle the case. It just means give them control over what they can do. So a lot of times I try to give my client some homework. I say, okay, when we get off the phone, I am going to do XYZ. I need you to gather these documents. This is what I'm going to do. This is what I expect from you. And this is and then we'll come back together and, exchange exchange homework and go from there. Always it helps to give your client something that they need to do, because we need things from our clients that we can't get ourselves. For example, mandatory disclosures in a divorce. There's lots of stuff that the client has to start gathering while we're prepping for trial or whatever. So it's helpful to give them some sense of control. This is your part of this case, and this is my part. And on that note, making your roles and responsibilities clear, going over your retainer in detail, making sure they don't have any questions, talking about, my job as the attorney is, I say a lot of times, my job as your attorney is to explain the law and try to, make a strategy and get you to where you wanted to be when you got to me. Your job as the client is to tell me, what has happened to you and what you want. What is your goal here? Like, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to help you accomplish what you came here to accomplish with me. I'm not here to dictate your case. I am here as the attorney. It is my job to strategize and to represent, but it is your job to tell me what you want, and your job to provide input on what has happened and what is going on and keep me informed. And I think that making sure that those roles and responsibilities are clear from the beginning really helps with that relationship and helps them trust you more, because you're not just like, all right, I'm the attorney, I'm in charge, you shouldn't do anything now, I'm going to tell you everything to do. That's not going to be a trusting, relationship where they're going to feel like, okay, good, I'm in good hands and I trust my attorney to do what's best for me, because I feel, they need to feel listened to and heard in order to continue to work with us, and in order to feel like we have their best interest in mind in our practice. Explaining the process as much as possible. And really, we need to back up when we think about, like, when I talk to a client, okay, this is what the hearing is going to look like generally. I can't predict how things are going to go in court. We all know that. But generally, we will go first as the petitioner. I will ask you some questions, kind of that, but also really specifics, like when you park over here. When you get to the courthouse, take a left. Don't bring any water in or firearms. Don't wear flip-flops. Like, all these, when we're in the room, we're going to be separate from the respondent, like really specific details, because especially with hearings, in trial, we can't predict what's going to happen. So what we can predict is like where the courthouse steps are and what it's going to look like to go through the security, and what they should not, what kind of clothing is not allowed, and things like that really help them understand. The less they have to think about to get to the hearing, the better, really. And the less that is new that they're walking into, the less stress they will be. Trial testifying is very stressful. So if they're also worried about, like, where do I park and how do I get to the chambers, like that's just adding to the stress, and it's going to be harder to get their testimony out at the actual hearing. And then, of course, explaining attorney-client privilege, and making sure, they know the limitations of it, but also that they know that they can trust you. You're not part of the system. You're their attorney. You're here to represent them. Everything they tell you is confidential. You have attorney-client privilege. You are protected. I am here for you. I am not here for the judge. I am not here for law enforcement. I'm here for you. And everything you tell me, we know the exceptions and the limitations, and we explain that. But generally, what you tell me ends here. It doesn't go anywhere else unless we decide that it's going to go somewhere else. If we decide you're going to testify to it, if I tell you it's really important to get this into your testimony, we work together, that's coming out. But anything you tell me is not going to go anywhere unless you give me permission, so that they know that they can trust you with this information. This is a big one, being forthcoming about the negative, but not just like, oh, you don't have a case. Explaining, I understand why you would have done this XYZ thing, but it doesn't look great in the law. I don't think the court is going to see this in the way that, that they're not going to see the justification for why you did this. So in this experience, or in this case, I don't think it's helpful to file a petition and to go to court. I understand that that isn't fair to you, and I understand that what you're experiencing and what you're telling me has been very stressful, but it doesn't rise to the level of an injunction. And I kind of take the like don't shoot the messengers strategy, where it's like, I'm not the law, I didn't define the law, I didn't make it, I'm not standing behind it, I'm here to counsel you on it and to explain it to you, but I'm the messenger and I'm not taking it on. I'm not taking responsibility for that law. So I apologize a lot for the law when I talk to clients and they don't have a good case or there's negative parts of their case. I'll say, I'm really sorry, but this is what the law says. And I'm not like taking it on. I'm not sorry, personally, but I understand and I'm acknowledging that they have gone through this traumatic incident and it doesn't rise to the level of an injunction. And that's got to be really stressful because there's a lot of trauma or, stalking, violence, not a lot of abuse that doesn't rise to the level of an injunction that still is absolutely abuse. And or for a better example maybe is that especially with the new 50-50 presumption for timesharing, clients will come and say, I want him to have supervised, but they don't have enough there. So instead of just, well, that's never going to happen, it's 50-50 or I'm out, I think it's important to say, like, I understand why you would want that. And I absolutely understand your concerns. But in this case, the presumption is that 50-50 is in the best interest of the children. And we don't have enough evidence to overcome that presumption. I think that is going to come across a lot better. And they're really going to hear that better than they would if you just said, look, you don't have enough for supervised visits, you're going to get 50-50, you're just going to have to deal with it. Like I wouldn't be receptive to that information either, and I know the law. So I just think it's important to really acknowledge their trauma and their desires and their needs and then explain the law. And if the two are incongruent, we don't have to take that on personally. We can say, like, unfortunately, what you need and what the law has to offer don't meet in the middle. But let's see what we can do, if anything, and I think that people, in my experience, are way more receptive to the bad news, the negative, if you deliver it in a way that is not judgmental and is not kind of harsh and acknowledges their experience while also acknowledging that the law doesn't see it that way, maybe. And then one thing I do a lot, especially on the hotline, is right out the gate, listen, I just want to tell you that I'm going to interrupt you as we go throughout this conversation. I am not trying to be rude. I just want to make sure I'm following everything as best as I can and that I'm not confusing or missing any details. So just, to be expected, I will interrupt you. And then when you do inevitably interrupt them because they're flooding or whatever, and you're trying to get the details of what happened next and they've jumped to last year, they've already expected that and they won't be so surprised and it won't be this as jarring as it would be if you were just cutting them off in the middle of a sentence without explaining that this would probably happen. Okay, validating the survivor. Again, it's important to validate them so that they feel good and supported, yes, but also checking in with them. Are you hearing me? Does this sound like a good plan? Do you understand what I just said? That active listening and making sure that they feel like they have it is a partnership. They are collaborating. They have a role in this. I have a role in this, and we are working together. One thing, again, this kind of goes with the negative, but validating their experience before delving into the legal questions and the merits of their case, just to kind of bring down that wall and say, like, wow, I hear you. I hear that this was a really stressful experience for you. I have some questions about some details. I'm going to get into that now, and then of course, giving space. Do you need a break? Do you want some water? Do you want to, take a minute? I think we can be very lawyer brained and just think like, okay, well, this is your case and this is the strengths and these are the weaknesses, but this is their life. And if we don't acknowledge that, they're going to shut down right away. Interrupting the flooding. These are some strategies that I would say that are helpful to interrupt some of that flooding. So like I had said earlier, let's put a pin in that. Let's talk about some details, what are your bank accounts? Like I think a lot of times I'll switch into equitable distribution type stuff and divorces. Like, okay, let's talk about the marital property for a minute, because that can be, not always, but it can be less stressful than the violence. we're not mental health counselors. I'm not saying that you have to try to be that, but, take a minute, take a breath. I know people talk about like, what can you engage their senses? What can you see, hear, things like that. But you don't have to do all that. Just like, can I get you some water? Do you want to take a break? I'm going to run to the restroom. Do you want to step outside for a second? We can blame it on ourselves. Say, I need a minute, just to make sure that they have a minute to regroup, engage their senses, change the subject. I've kind of touched on all this. And then just a note that do not touch them, do not touch their shoulder, rub anything unless they have consented to that or that you ask. I generally stay away from touching my clients unless I know for sure that they have welcomed that and have given affirmative consent. But really, I think the safe thing is, just don't, you can shake their hand, if they want to give you a hug, you can engage in that if you want, but don't touch them unless you know for sure that they have consented to being touched in any way. Monitor your reaction. So I think it's also important to make sure that we are not like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened to you. I would never survive that. Or, I don't know what I would do. Like, we don't want to be so shocked about what they've told us. And I think, as attorneys, we've probably heard a lot. So maybe we're not shocked anymore. But we need to make sure that we are checking in with ourselves, that we are not reacting very largely to what they're telling us. I'm not saying just ignore it and say, oh yeah, I've heard that 1,000 times, but there's a balance there between acknowledging what happened to them and being shocked. And then, just kind of, oh, I've heard that 1,000 times before. That can't really be something that bothered you. So we don't want to minimize it. We don't want to exaggerate it. Take your own breaks, avoid judging your clients. I think that we can fall into this. Well, if I was in that position, I wouldn't have done X, Y, Z. But the bottom line is we are not in this position. We are not our clients. We did not grow up with I can't put myself in anyone else's shoes. I fully believe that we cannot put ourselves in anyone else's shoes. And I say that to say that because of that, we should not judge anyone else or any of their choices, because we are not them and we cannot pretend to be them because we didn't grow up like them. We didn't have all the same environment. Like, I can say if I were you, I would have done something different, but I'm not you. And so everyone is making their own choices for reasons that we may not understand. And it is not our place to judge them. It is our place to counsel them and to explain, maybe what some smart choices are during the litigation or like as co-parenting, things like that. But it is not our place to judge. Well, I don't think, I can't believe that happened to you. I wouldn't have even been in that situation in the first place. It's not our place to tell them how to live their lives. It's our place to represent them in this case. And that's it, and just trying to keep an emotional distance, knowing your triggers. These are all sort of getting into the how to take care of yourself in this process, which I know Samantha is going to delve deep into that next week. So I'm not going to go into this too much. But one thing I do want to talk about is assisting in the storytelling. So, this is especially important in those flooding moments. I keep notes. I keep really detailed notes. And I tell my client, again, managing expectations, I'm going to take some notes while you talk. It is because I want to make sure that I keep everything straight. Make a little timeline, make little bullet points. Just that'll really help your client to feel like you're listening to them, and it'll help you get the story straight so that when they're here, oh yeah, okay, I'm going to this bullet point, filling in a little details. Okay, well now we're here. I'm going to fill in details here. So it's not just all this information that you have to organize later. You're organizing it as you're talking to them. Use the client's language when you talk to them. Mirror their language for the most part. So if a client says, my partner, don't call that person their husband or, boyfriend, spouse, whatever. Like I use, wife, partner, I use the language that they're using. And I don't define this other person for them. Ask only what you need to know. We as attorneys need to know a lot in order to represent their case. And we need to know a lot more than we end up having to show the judge. But we just, make sure that what you're asking is not for your own curiosity. It is for the benefit of the case. I think that's just something to keep in mind. We do want, why were, what happened? Why were you there? Or whatever the detail is. If we don't need to know it to represent them, don't ask it. And avoid ending on a low note. This is something I learned from my therapist. When you finish an interview, if you send them off crying, they're going to remember that, associate that experience with your interactions. And they're always going to be, it's going to start to become triggering to even talk to you. So we want to make sure, okay, so, one thing I say is like, what are you going to do for yourself? What do you have planned for the rest of the day? Are you going to, what are you and your kids going to do after this? Or how are you going to, take care of yourself today, whatever it is, or getting back to, the property, or just kind of bringing it to something less stressful at the very end so that they can recover before they leave your office or before they end that call. So I know it's a little past 1. I'm not sure if we I don't know if we want to have some input, if people want to stay on and give more thoughts. That's kind of all I have for presentation wise. So we can, Alexis, how do you want to open up for discussion if people have thoughts? Or I didn't check the
Yeah,
Q&A.
absolutely. And what I can do in the meantime is put the CLE code in the chat.
Perfect.
And, I think something that we had discussed is, sort of not recording and letting people have discussion at this point.
Yes.
Everyone is automatically on mute, but if anybody did want to come off of mute and talk or have a discussion, I can individually take the person off mute and put them back on mute after the question's asked. So I'm going to pop the CLE code into the chat first. And
Perfect.
then, I'll take us off of the recording, and I'm okay to hang, for as long as you are.
Yeah, that's great.
Awesome. So let me put this in. The CLE code is, and this one got a lot of CLE credit. So it is 230959. N as in Nancy. Oops. And I just sent that to an individual person. I'm sorry. Let me redo that. Didn't mean to do that. And that is 2.5 general CLEs and 1.0 of your mental health and wellness CLE. So again, it's in the chat, but that's 230959. N as in Nancy. And so what I'm going to do now is, like I said, everybody is on mute. So the way that folks will be able to interact is by raising their hand. If you raise your hand, I'll see it here and I'll be able to unmute you. And so with that being said, I'm going to quickly stop the recording now.